Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Chats with Kat on the Voice of Adoptees podcast. I'm your host, Kat, and I hope you're all having a wonderful week so far. Don't forget to grab your coffee, tea, or a preferred beverage and settle on in. I am currently here with Jenny, who is a holistic therapist and a clinical social worker. So, Jenny, welcome to the show, and briefly introduce yourself to those who are listening.
Yeah, so my name is Jenny Flora Wells. I am an associate clinical social worker in California, and I specialize in holistic therapy, specifically for adoptees, as well as trauma. And I work a lot with artists as well, so it's cool to see the intersection there. And yeah, really excited to be here.
So let's begin this journey on this episode. Let's start out with you and your relationship to adoption. Where are you adopted from?
Yeah, so I was adopted from Hollywood, Florida, which is actually a suburb of Miami. And this was in 1997, so back in the 90s. I know specifically for people who are knowledgeable about like the birth certificate stuff with adoptees, I think 97 is one of the cutoff years with certificates being locked. So that's very interesting about my story as well. Yeah, I was adopted from Miami or Hollywood in 97 from my birth mother. And she was a very rebellious, very eclectic kind of person and was really into music. And she was also going through just a really difficult period of her life, was struggling with substance use, incarceration, homelessness, mental health issues, and was currently doing sex work. And so these things, together and these struggles that she was having were obviously very difficult and made it hard for her to go through birth. And then, she did decide to go through with, adoption with a private agency, which was best for her at the time. And she, I think, was working through, from what we've been told, was working with a few different families that I think had expressed interest. As we know, in the private adoption world, sometimes that can be a little weird and controversial. And, there's a lot of weird things that happen in private agencies, of course. But yeah, she was speaking to a few different families, and she ultimately decided on my adoptive parents, who are in Ohio, and they were two lawyers in their 40s that couldn't conceive at the time and, were really wanting to start a family and had been looking into adoption for a while. And so that's kind of where my story began. So they flew down to Miami to adopt me, and were really good about taking like adoption competency classes. And we're trying, the best that they could to, especially in the 90s, right, when knowledge about mental health and adoption in general, I think, were much more sparse. I, truly did the best that they can with trying to educate themselves on what that looked like. So yeah, that's how my story kind of began. I always knew that I was adopted. It was always something that was, I think, a gift to me, and something that I still to this day find very unique about myself and my story. And so, yeah, that's where it all began.
Wow, that's amazing. And so when your adoptive father told you that you're adopted, what was kind of running through your mind? You were saying that it was a very open experience, a very open discussion, which is, I want to say it's becoming more common, but back then I don't think it was as common potentially. For parents to say, yes, you're adopted. It's more like, well, you're my child. Even though you're adopted, you're, the sense of you belong to me sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what's so interesting about adoption is that it's so individual, for each adoptee. And we all have such diverse and eclectic experiences that we bring to the table. And it's very interesting to see, how, we all come from that same, experience, but each is so individual. So for me personally, I can't really even remember, the first time that I learned or understood that I was adopted, which I think is a beautiful thing. Probably means that I just, from the time that I could remember, was told to my own understanding of, my story and adoption in general. So I always knew that I was adopted. I think my first memory of kind of pairing that with my like current experience in my life was I was in third grade and we did like a show and tell. And I was very proud that I was adopted. And so I actually brought in a picture of my birth mom for show and tell. And I wanted to explain to the people in my class that that I was adopted and, I loved my parents. And I also, had this love, for my, birth family as well. And so it was kind of a beautiful moment of me starting to bring in that understanding of what adoption means for me. So I think that was like my first like bold memory of being an adoptee and what that looked like for me as a young child. So yeah.
Wow. Like, so obviously that's quite young. And you said that you had a picture of your birth mother, which is really great because there are many, many cases of adoption where it's closed. It's completely closed and there's no picture, there's no records, there's nothing. So, I'm happy that you were able to at least have a picture of your mother. And, this leads me to ask a few questions about your birth mother, where I'm wondering, were you excited to look at her and be like, I look like this person? Or like, how similar to her are you? You said she's very, like, basically like free spirited. And how similar to you is she?
Yes, very free spirited.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I love that question, Kat. You said that so well. So that's what's kind of interesting is she looks completely different from me. So if you look at a picture of her, she actually has very blonde hair. She has blue eyes. Like you were saying, she is very like free spirited. And the picture actually, I need to figure out where it went. I know it's somewhere at my dad's house, but it was a picture of her next to a tree, which is funny being somebody who's like very free spirited and explorative. But I think that, kind of bringing in my therapist knowledge too, I think we all, are tied to our ancestry and also like these intergenerational patterns that allow us to connect with family, whether that be birth family or adoptive family. I think that it comes from both nature and nurture, right? I think that they both, are incredibly strong for adoptees. So for me personally, having that understanding that I am an adoptee, I don't know, there was something just really special about having that photo. My adoptive mother and my birth mother were pen pals for a while after I was born, which I think is really beautiful. So it was a closed adoption, but they sent letters back and forth. And I'm not sure what, piqued the interest there with that. But I think maybe it was just, the connection of the adoption triad. I think sometimes depending on the situation, right? Everybody's situation is different. There was something, that spoke to my birth mother and, she really just wanted to reach out. And so there are a few letters going back and forth. And I think that's when she sent the photo of her. And I also have a Christmas ornament that she sent me on my first birthday. That's this like little pillow and it has I have it hanging in my childhood bedroom. And it has a little like rocking, what is it? The rocking pony or
right.
What is that called?
Yeah, the rocking horse.
Yeah, it has one of those. Yes, rocking horse. And then on the back of the little pillow, I think she said like, the date, like it was, she said like 1998 and, from your birth mother, what have you, I'll have to look at it. But yeah, so they kept in touch for, I think a year or so back and forth and, things kind of drifted away, but it allowed, I think, my adoptive mother at the time to have an understanding of, more about my story, more about where I came from and, what kind of created a shift in my birth mother's life to create, the adoption triad. And so it was very interesting. But I know that it's different for everybody and closed adoptions can be difficult for adoptees as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, because a lot of things that come with adoption is like your identity, right? Our identity, all we know is that we are supposed to be either similar to, look like, something along those lines, our birth parents. So I want to talk about something really quickly
Yes.
because you mentioned nature versus nurture. Now, this is something that I've always found very interesting, and I have always kind of wondered in terms of how adoptees go through their life, right? Some
Yeah.
people, like in my case, there was a adopted sibling that I knew, and he went down a very dark path. And my adoptive mother would say,
Mm.
"Well, he became what he came from. That's just who he is. He was always that way." Right? So that just
Mm-hmm.
plays into the nature part of it, right? But I grew up in a very similar
Yeah.
situation, and I turned out nothing like that. So that goes into, I think, the
Yeah.
nurture part of it, right? I go off of the way that I was raised, and I take the lessons from that. So I want to know if you've, in speaking in therapy sessions or anything like that, if there's anything like this that you've also kind of noticed among the adoptee community, because I just think it's very interesting, that kind of
Yeah.
debate, nature versus nurture with adoptees.
Yeah. Ah, you have the deepest questions. I love it. I'm very like existential, and I love deep conversations on this.
Same.
Yeah, I think that the nature versus nurture, the nature versus nurture thing is, it's so. Again, I hate the cliche answer, but it's very complex, and it's individual to each person's experience, of course, and their own ancestry and intergenerational trauma, and all the things that come together. At the core of it, I think that, if we're thinking of just people in general, like all people are born good. I think it's what happens to us in life, what's passed down to us through intergenerational trauma that causes us to respond in a certain way. So if we're thinking about the actual behaviors, right, like, you had mentioned how an adoptive sibling was going down a dark path, right? And whatever that looked like for the individual. Specifically, kind of in the realm of therapy, but I love to talk to people about this. There's a theory and a therapy modality called internal family systems. It has nothing to do with family therapy, but it's more about the internal family system of the mind. And it's all about it's about how the mind is multiple, right? We have all of these different things that go into creating who we are as a person. So if we're thinking of those, defenses and coping skills that come out, for folks who go down a darker path, right? And what most of us mean when we say go down a darker path, right, is usually, substance use, dangerous or reckless
Crime.
behavior, aggression, yeah, crime, like the things I talked about with my birth mom, right? Utilizing these things for most experiences, not trying to put an umbrella over everything, but to numb, right, from the hurt that somebody
Right.
feels. So with internal family systems, it helps each individual understand what that internal family system in the mind looks like for them. So with IFS, we have managers, firefighters, and exiles. So managers are the parts of us, and you go much deeper with this. It's a very complex modality, but just summarizing it, with managers, these are the parts that come out for us that are organizing our daily life, that are managing, the things that we have to do in a day, that are managing our emotions, right? That are keeping us protected from the things that make us feel triggered. Then we have, like, if you're thinking of like soldiers on a battlefield, you have the managers that are in the front, and then in the middle, you have firefighters. So that's what you're talking about right now with this adoptive sibling. So with the firefighters, this is like our second line of protection, right? So if we're thinking of a battlefield, we've got the first one that are the managers, then the firefighters. And typically with those firefighters, this is where we see those more intense defense mechanisms, or what most people will deem as unhealthy coping mechanisms. Right. I like to steer clear of that language, because it is things that keep people safe, right? It's something that keeps people going, and it's their body trying to keep them protected, even if it is hurting them in the moment, right? So these are where we see substance use, and, we see, I literally wasn't even thinking about that. Right. That's too funny. We see substance use, media consumption too. I mean, all of us have our firefighters. We all have our things. And then that third deepest level, with internal family systems are the exiles. So these are the parts of us that are wounded from childhood. And typically when we start to identify these exiles or these wounded parts of self, like the higher self, we are able to go back to an individual age and time and childhood that can really be pinpointed at each exile. So that was kind of a long-winded answer to what you were talking about. But with nature and nurture, I really think that it has a lot to do with what happens to us. And I think there's a lot that we still don't know about why that causes certain people to respond in certain ways. I do think that some of it is, what we carry inside of us through, ancestral, connection. And I think some of it too is especially our experience during childhood. You have to think of as kids, we're sponges. Right. So we soak in everything, even when we're in the womb. So especially if you think of adoptees, we are soaking in everything that our birth mother is going through. We're soaking in also after we're born, as babies, since we can't communicate fully through language yet, right? We use sound, we use, screaming and crying and, making random noises. But the way that we communicate and soak in the world around us is through this, neuroception, sensation, facial expression, emotion, and energy, right? And so when we go through the process of being separated from our birth mother, somebody that in a very ancestral way, we have that connection to because we've been in the womb for, 9 months and we have this connection to our birth mom, that is traumatic. Yes, it might not be something that we can remember, but the body remembers.
I have to stop you because that I didn't really understand.
You're fine.
And no. I mean, in the sense where it's like, I've heard this before and I heard it after I experienced something myself where when I was very fortunate that I found my biological family and like my blood was screaming. It just knew that like I'm related to this person. So when you just said that, like your body knows, and it does. And also, I as well as many, many other adoptees, like we believe that adoption usually starts as a loss. And just because you don't remember it because you're a child doesn't mean your body doesn't remember it, right? Also, another point that I want to another thing that I want to point out is John Locke actually wrote in his essay of Human Understanding that children, when you're born, they're not only very impressionable, but they are influenced by the people that are around them because we are immediately put into the parents' arms, right? And then when you grow up in that family, you are influenced by everything that the family does, says, acts, whatever. And it's not really until you're an adult that you can make your own decisions and make your own thoughts, that you grow out of that and you kind of do this third party reflection thing. Like, wait a minute, like, how did I grow up? How did this affect me, sort of thing? And introspection is very important. And I think it's very beneficial, especially to everybody, but really to also adoptees in particular. I think a lot of healing can be promoted from it.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yes, I totally agree with that. And I think that really falls under the knowledge and information out there about intergenerational trauma, especially pertaining to adoptees. Because if you think about it, we're getting a double dose. We're not just getting the sponginess from our adoptive family that we grew up with, but we also have within our bodies that intergenerational trauma from our birth family. And so in society, when adoption is, in my opinion, still something that is not represented enough and in an appropriate way. I think that it's something that still is seen as very black and white in society. It's just like, well, you're adopted and now you're in your your adopted family and that's it. That's your family. And it is. And we also have this identity outside of that too, which is like, that we identify with the adoption triad. I go back to that because it really is so true, right? It's the adoptive family, it's the birth family, but it's also us. How do we see ourselves in our own identity, in our own world, of who we are, because we have been taken from one family and put into a new family. And so it brings about, I think, more questions about identity than the typical person would ask themselves. But yes, to answer your question too, and what we were talking about, I think it's interesting that adoptees get this double dose of intergenerational trauma. But what you'll notice in the research is that adoptees are barely mentioned when it comes to intergenerational trauma and things of that nature. In my opinion, I think that we are still very underrepresented in the mental health field. Absolutely.
I agree. And I would like to get into a few different mental health topics. I mean, we're talking about generational trauma, which is a very real thing. There are many individuals out there that think it is a myth, but it is a very real thing, especially when you come from a country that has experienced such hardships. And it is something that unfortunately, like we kind of experience, and we don't realize that we're experiencing it. Or at least, I won't speak for everyone, but for me, like, there were certain things or certain ways that I would react, and I didn't understand why I was reacting that way. So what I've come to the conclusion of is that I am reacting this way, going back to the firefighters and the generals and all of that. I've kind of put a wall up between me and whatever it is that I'm feeling, because I'm trying to protect myself in a way, right? And to me, the
Yes.
way that I'm equating what you're saying with that, which I think is brilliant, I equate it like a very long hallway in my mind, and there's all of these doors, and some are open, some are closed, some are just wide open, some have different colors on them, and then it's like you have the red door section that is chained and barred, and you're scared to go in them because you're afraid to feel the deep emotions that came along with whatever moment in your life that it is. And you mentioned about, going
Yeah.
back to exiling when you were like a child. And I think of it and I'm like, most of my red door moments are when I was a child, right? So it's interesting how I am processing the different things that I have been through and how I am putting them behind the red doors with the chains, and I don't want to go in because I don't want to deal with my own feelings. And then I cope physically in the real world by vaping, trying to numb myself and just trying to get through my life because I've been
Yes.
through so much. So it's all very interesting, and I
Yeah.
love talking about psychology along with adoption because the two go hand in hand. It's very, very important. And I always think it's really important for
Yeah.
adoptees to hear this. It's important for adoptive parents to hear this so that they can better help their adoptive child cope and feel like they are heard and to feel validated in their experiences and their feelings.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I completely agree with you, Kat. And I think that it's something that is so deep and so, complex. Like I was saying, like there's so many different aspects, that go into individuals' healing journeys, especially adoptees. And I think on top of it too, what you have to consider as well, thinking about diverse experiences and especially very diverse adoption stories is, how does culture come into play? How does identity come into play? How does, intercountry adoption come into play? Which are things that I can't personally relate to in my own adoption story. But I think those are also very important topics, with adoption that, again, are very underrepresented in the mental health field. And again, if you look up a lot of the research for adoption in general, especially when it comes to cultural and intercountry and, things that add to the diversity of the experience, there's, the research that is out there is so black and white.
Right.
And it doesn't bring up the, systemic, intersectionality that comes with being an adoptee and, also being in a mixed family, or whatever that may be for the individual. And so it's something that I hope, through my practice and what I'm doing as a therapist, that I can help others feel represented in this space of healing and know that, there are therapists and people out there who do understand their experience and want to advocate for better representation, when it comes to adoption and adoptees and, being able to tell our story and the complexities that come with that. So, yeah.
So in your practice, what are some other battles that you have noticed your adoptee clients face or what have you noticed among the adoption
Yeah.
community that is very common that people face?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think, like we were kind of saying, earlier with adoptees, I think that I work with traditionally a more younger generation, I would say, more millennials and Gen Z. But I would say that, the things that I'm going to talk about are relevant for most people. I think trauma is like a really big thing. And then with adoptees, though, like I was saying, it's like times two, right? It's the things that we're dealing with across the board, but for adoptees, it gets more complex for them. I would say, though, adding on to that, I think for adoptees, going back to, somatic work and in the body and these exiles that we have that are, really deep for most adoptees, is that we have these unprocessed emotions in the body and trauma that I think a lot of people at the root are looking to work on in therapy. But with more traditional therapy approaches, adoptees tend to feel gaslit in the space, when therapists might be saying, how can we reframe your thoughts in a more positive way? And yes, that can be beneficial for some people, but I would say, in my opinion, for most people, they have something going on deep down in the roots of their story and their experience that most of the time are tied back to trauma. And so it's like, how can we utilize different modalities to help the client build somatic awareness and connection to the body, the ability to be present, and also the ability to tap into that to release unprocessed trauma. These things that we hold inside that in our very advanced society, we have really lost, connection to our bodies and the way that we can heal ourselves, that inner healer. And so in the work that I'm doing, especially with adoptees, it's like, how can I help individuals rediscover that inner healer within themselves? Because I think that we all have the power to heal ourselves. And I think adoptees, are special in and of itself, because I think we can really empathize with other people's experiences. And also, we come from such unique backgrounds that I think makes healing that much more transformational. So, yeah.
So list some techniques that you use with your clients, and what have you found that really works and benefits the person in the room at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously there is IFS, what I was talking about earlier, which is internal family systems. I love utilizing that to specifically bring out those, defenses and coping skills, right, that we utilize on a daily basis, coming from the body that help to keep us safe. And I think that IFS helps us to see that these things that we are utilizing as coping skills and things that are helping to protect us are coming from a good place in the body. They might not feel good. They might not be very healthy, right? But they're things that have helped us survive up to this point. And so when we can really transform the way that we see these inner protective mechanisms and how they go back ancestrally and even through how animals function as well, we start to see ourselves a lot different. And it helps to heal that shame. I think that comes with mental health struggles and trauma, and even the shame that comes with being an adoptee, that we get in society as well. But along with IFS, I think that what is paramount to individuals moving through trauma, especially adoptees, since we're talking about intergenerational trauma and the complexities that come with that, I really love to utilize EMDR therapy and somatic therapy. So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It was actually created by a therapist named Francine Shapiro. She was going through a cancer diagnosis and was walking through the woods one day and was stepping back and forth, and her eyes were kind of going back and forth as she was walking. And she started to notice that as she was continuing that movement of going back and forth on the left and right sides of her body, that her distress was going down. So this was like shocking to her, and something that she just really snowballed into this beautiful research behind bilateral movement and how that can help reprocess trauma. So specifically through her research, she founded this amazing modality that has helped so many individuals, especially adoptees, with targeting those unprocessed memories that we're talking about, right? Like, when we were talking about the act of being, separated from birth mom, and how those sensations and that neuroception that comes with that, the body knows, right? So with that, in the lens of EMDR is targeting that unprocessed memory, as well as the emotions, the beliefs, and the body sensations that we associate with it. And then through that exploration that we do with EMDR, we then utilize bilateral movement. She also figured out with her research that it's not just eye movement. It's any kind of movement that goes from the right to the left sides of the body. So this could be eye movements, tapping, auditory cues, whatever works best for the individual. And basically you're activating the brain's information processing system that allows old memories to be reprocessed. You can see this when we sleep with REM sleep, when our eyes move rapidly back and forth. So for many adoptees specifically, the trauma that we have experienced happened before we even developed the language to explain the events that we have experienced. So the memory is somatic in nature and stored in the nervous system. So it's especially a game changer, for adoptees when we're able to tap into the body and, get in touch with the nervous system to really release that stored trauma within the body. So, yeah.
So I love that. Especially you've introduced me to something I've actually never heard of. I've never heard of the moving the eyes back and forth or back and forth on the left and the right side of the body. I think that's really interesting. And it reminded me of soothing techniques that people do to also help cope with a situation, right? Before we were talking about the physical things that people might do that are sort of addictions. But there's also other things that people do to cope, and that's soothing. Oh gosh, it's called soothing something. I'm not sure if it's like movements or it's, I know you're going to know what I'm talking about. But for example, for me, I have to be honest, and going back and forth, like, it's funny. I used to, at the edge of my bed, I would sit on the floor and I would shake my head back and forth from left to right. And that would be a very comforting thing for me. It would help me relax. I would be able to kind of go into this imaginary state. And I sit here and I say that it helps me deal with like creativity. And it really like was the catalyst into my imagination and how I became very close with it in a way. But I know other people will do like thumb sucking, maybe people bite nails or something like that, right? So what are there any kind of soothing techniques that you think are also common among adoptees trying to move forward that maybe we're not so sure of or we're just not aware of?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that's so fascinating, Kat, that you were talking about, the moving back and forth, and of you going like this, you're getting in touch with the left and the right hemispheres of the brain, which is cool. It's that bilateral movement. You can see this too, even when we have a baby that's crying, right? What are we doing? We're rocking the baby back and forth, right? It's a different kind of bilateral movement, but it's still that very calming motion that most of us are very accustomed to from being a baby. So that's a typical one, that we see and that you can actually integrate through somatic therapy and even do on your own is very slow rocking motions. What does it feel like when we rock really slowly back and forth? With EMDR specifically, when we're going through the processing stage, we utilize the bilateral movement or the, rocking, whatever that may be, very fast. And that's what helps us process is when it's going really fast back and forth. But we can also use bilateral movement very slowly to help enhance, regulation techniques, nervous system exercises, things of that nature that just help our brain kind of process that exercise and kind of make it more cemented in the mind. So any type of that movement of moving back and forth, this could be dancing, this could be yoga even. Yoga is really great as well with building that somatic connection, right? Like, what does it feel like when we stretch our body in a certain way and, sit with that discomfort in a trauma-informed way, of course, within our window of tolerance.
Right.
I think personally, I encourage adoptees who feel, disconnected from their body, or maybe they have like a hyper vigilant nervous system, or maybe they feel like they're in a freeze state all the time, right? Dealing with like depression, feeling very stuck. Across the board, I think it's really important to, even in tiny baby steps, getting in touch with the body, with whatever feels most comfortable to you, right? And it's different for everybody. And the body it can be very vulnerable to do that work, right? Especially living in a society where we are so separated from our bodies and how we can process trauma through them. And so even if it's just, what does it feel like for me to sit here with a hand over my heart and a hand over my stomach, and just allowing me to sit here and just feel the motion of my heartbeat and of my stomach going up and down, right? What does it feel like for me to just very gently, like I'm just moving ever so slightly back and forth. So it can be just these small, tiny micro movements that allow us to explore what this feels like inside our body. And it sounds very simple, but it's, somatic awareness and that somatic connection within the body really starts with just being the curious observer. What happens if, instead of allowing the parts with internal family systems rather, to kind of come through and be like, oh, you're doing this wrong, because we all have our parts, we all have these voices, right, that come in and say certain things at certain times and get triggered, so definitely welcoming them as they come in throughout our healing journey, especially with the body and somatics. And what does it feel like to just be curious about that? So when those parts do come through, those protectors, what happens when we just sit with that? We're just going to continue the motion, obviously within our window of tolerance. We don't want to trigger ourselves, but we feel just a mild level of discomfort, just kind of going with that, noticing what comes through. And it's very eye-opening to see the specific parts that come through for us when we do certain motions, or we, are doing certain exercises or whatever that may be, because like we talked about, the body remembers, all of this is connected.
Right.
And with our nervous system specifically, I'm just going to explain this like super fast, because of course this is a complex topic, but specifically with connecting the brain with the body, we have our brain, obviously, we have the limbic system within the brain, which is all about emotions. And then in our neck, what happens is we have the brain stem that goes down to, the spine, and through that is the vagus nerve that goes all the way down and then follows all the nerves throughout the rest of the body, which is the nervous system. So if we're thinking about how our brain and our body communicate, it's very eye-opening to know that, because it's all communicating through that vagus nerve that's within the neck. And so, there's messages that go from the brain to the body. There's messages that go from the body to the brain. There's been some research recently too that now there's a lot of conflicting opinions on this in the mental health world and with neuroscientists and things of that nature. But there is some research that is coming out that says that the body is communicating more with the brain than the brain is communicating with the body. So specifically in the lens of mental health, we have traditionally thought of therapeutic modalities to be most beneficial when they are top down, meaning we start with the brain and then we feel better on in the body.
I think.
And there's more coming out with that of what happens if we do a bottom-up approach. What happens if we start with the body, with that somatic awareness, with, what it feels like to be us and to embody this soul and be the human that we are, and then moving up to more of those cognitive structures. So for me in my practice, I try to kind of approach it in an integrative way. I do love bottom-up approaches, but I think as well, when we live in a society that is so cognitive-based,
Right.
we all utilize language to communicate with one another, like it's all very cognitive-based. We do still need some of that to start our healing journey and kind of, in a relational way, build that connection with our therapist and then begin to explore some of those bottom-up approaches. But yeah, that's kind of the myriad of things with healing and how it connects to the body with trauma, and especially for adoptees. So yeah.
So for me, because you mentioned way earlier that we can all heal ourselves. And I am very much a supporter of that statement. I very much believe that because
Yeah.
I had to heal myself. When I went to different therapists, they just didn't help me in the way that I needed. And actually, at the time,
Yeah.
there was just nobody there that was going to understand me, right? So now it's much different
Yeah.
of a situation where there are people like you who focus on holistic therapy and somatic therapy. There are also adoption therapists out there nowadays. But for me, the only one of the ways that I
Yes.
got through it was I had to kind of do that, but in a different way, where I I connected very much to nature and I envisioned like in my mind what
Yes.
my space looked like, where I pictured it as a house, right? So anyone
Mm.
can pick any kind of house. It could be an apartment, it can be like I don't know, a Mediterranean style house, whatever. Mine was a cottage and it was surrounded by all this beauty, which I was like,
Oh,
okay,
love.
I want that to be my outlook on life, right? I want the beauty to be that life is beautiful. And when you go into the house, it's every asset of you because remember, you can decorate the space, right?
Mm.
So you walk in, it's like a cottage house with wooden floors and a wooden dining table and just old cabinetry and cupboards, and everything is like yellow and lilac and very pastel and very spring and very nature, lots of green. Maybe there's like a pet dog, obviously, and things like that. And the way that I started dealing with the voices, because they are very powerful. Negative, we tend to remember the bad more than we
Yes.
remember the good because bad will bring us more of an
Yep.
emotion and a reaction than a positive thing. Unless it is something so positive that is like, there are certain people that maybe are like more positive than negative. For me, that was just not the case. I can remember every single detail of every
Yeah.
bad moment in my life. And if you ask me about the positive ones, I'll tell you the gist because I don't remember the details. Right. So that's the way I work.
Yes.
So the only way that I could try to heal myself is I had to remember, I had to personify the negative voices. And what they would have to do is they'd have to knock on the door of the house and I could let them in for tea. And then I would say, okay, now you may go. Right. And then you're kind of there picking up the remnants, but you can always know that you can throw them out and get rid of them. So, sometimes it's a little
Hmm.
bit harder to clean up than others. It takes a little bit longer. Maybe, you're struggling for like a little bit of time, but negative things pass. And that is how I began to heal myself and go through that journey with myself
Yeah.
because it takes a lot. And I try to say this as much as possible, where I say, like, I'm proud of who you were, the journey you took to get to who you are today, because that was difficult. I'm proud of who you are today because you worked very
Mm.
hard to get here. And I'm proud of the journey you're on now to get to the person you want to become. Because nothing about a journey is ever easy, but it's important to take those moments to recognize this is where I came from. This is the progress I'm making, even no matter how small it is. And this is where I'm trying to go. And by looking at it in this sort of way, like with the house, you can look around and be like, this little plate represented like me walking out some bad emotions, or maybe this flower represents this, or however you decorate the space in your mind, you can look around in the space in your mind and be like, I remember when I did this. And it's a very positive and uplifting sort of thing. And for me, like, trying to get closer to my body is interesting because I never understood how to go about it, but actually I feel like I have more of an understanding after talking with you. And the way that you've explained it, I feel, is very clear and concise, and I can understand what you're saying. And now it's kind of like, okay, trying to connect to your body to me means trying to ultimately connect to your spirit, right? I kind of break it down like there's a triad in adoption, there's a triad in myself, where it's like you have spirit, you have the logic, and then you have the emotion, right? Emotion is kind of the negative things a lot of time, for me at least. Logic is like, okay, let's be logical about this, and then spirit is like happy all the time. So, kind of understanding like where
Yeah.
you are in balance with each other within yourself helps, I think, move you forward. Just in general, as an individual, as an adoptee, just no matter who you are and what you're going through, sort of thing. Sorry, that was a very long comment. I just
No, I love that. That was beautiful. And I love how you were able to utilize visualization to personify those parts. And that personification that you're talking about is quite literally parts work or internal family systems. It's the same thing. That's all we do with the modality. It's how can we personify these parts? We all have them, right? We all have parts, just the way to categorize them. Mm-hmm. And it's these pieces of, ourselves that keep us safe and manage and, fend for our protection. And if you think about ancestrally too, with the people who came before us, society and civilization in general looked completely different, right? Way, way, way back when, people would be hunters and gatherers and live, either in a small village or, a very small area with a small group of people. And, what they were fending was the weather or, sickness or, fighting, arguing with other people, whatever that may be. But it wasn't all of this overstimulation that we have in today's world. And so basically what's happening is we live in this body that is still very ancestral, but we live in a world that is so technologically advanced that the messages aren't computing very well. Right. So we see people who, living in our society that is very fast paced, and we have these protective mechanisms in us that have a purpose. They're not meant to go away, right? If we didn't have fight or flight, if we didn't have anxiety, if we didn't have that depression or freeze state, what would happen when we are in danger and we need to use that, right? It's that primitive response that will always be with us. It's a human experience, but it's understanding that and having the compassion of like, oh, these messages that I've been receiving is my body trying to keep me safe and is trying to tell me something, based on the society that we're in, which is very dysregulated, right? And so I think part of it too, especially with adoptees, right, who have a more diverse healing journey that tends to be more complicated at times, is also understanding too the impacts of society, that fall onto our healing journeys as well, right? A lot of people have jobs that are very fast paced and, they don't have a lot of time for themselves to dedicate towards self-care and that somatic connection and, building that relationship with self. And so, another thing that's very important in my practice is like, how can we find that balance and that compassion within ourselves of like, this isn't my fault, right?
Right.
We all do the best that we can within the society that we live. And, there are always ways that we can find healing and that we can, kind of sandwich it in the moments that we do have on our own outside of work and what have you. And it's important to know that it's not your fault and you're doing the best that you can. And these messages that you're feeling from the body, while they can be uncomfortable, while they can be scary and, something that we do feel the need to push away because we've been experiencing them for so many years. I just want people to know, and obviously through the work that I'm doing too, we're, building up to this point where we're like, what would it look like to show some of this compassion, for this body, this being that is so wonderful and has kept us safe and has protected us through all this trauma that we've gone through, right? So I think at the core of it, with all of these deep and meaningful points that we've touched on, I think, the lifeblood of the healing journey and of healing the nervous system is nuance. How do we welcome two things being true at once, which is naturally so connected to being an adoptee, right? Multiple things can be true at once. Adoption is such a gift and it's also traumatic, right? It's very nuanced. And so what happens when we can kind of transform those past beliefs of something being very black and white to something having multiple truths at once, it really transforms the way we see ourselves and the way that we can heal. Like you were saying too, with the healing journey, right? It's not just going to a therapist or taking medication or, just focusing on the adoption, right? Nothing is a panacea. it's nuanced. It's, looking at things from different perspectives and, exploring into, different avenues of healing and community too, as we are communal beings, and understanding intergenerational trauma. And yeah. But that's the beauty of the journey, right? Is that it doesn't have to be one path. It doesn't have to be black and white. It's rainbow. So, yeah.
So for our viewers, what is the best way to get in touch with you so that maybe they can reach out and work on themselves in a deeper way and have someone to guide them through the process?
Yeah, absolutely. So currently I am an associate clinical social worker in California. So right now I'm only able to work with people in California, but I know that there's a social work compact that's coming through in the next year or so, which could open me up to a few more states. So I'll definitely keep you updated, Kat, and we will correct the description if it changes, and we'll put the different states that are on there. So if you guys find us in the future, that'll be on there. But I'm currently working just in California. And so basically I can work with anybody who's located in the state of California. And if you're interested in contacting me and learning more, or just visiting my website, I've got a lot of great resources on there and a blog, and you're more than welcome to utilize those. I want everybody to find healing and accessibility wherever possible. My website is just my name, jennyflorawells.com. It's the same with my email too, jennyflorawells@gmail.com. So yeah, that's where you find me.
So thank you all for joining me on this episode of Chats with Kat. A very, very special thank you to our guest, Jenny. Thank you so much. Everyone stay tuned for another episode of Chats with Kat on the Voice of Adoptee podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, rate, and share this episode so that Jenny's voice and story can be heard. And always remember, someone somewhere is thinking of you. You are not alone.